Joe here with JoeMartinMVC, and it's time for another headlight restoration video for us. Today we're looking at the big box store kits that you're able to buy to help restore your headlights. The one we're using in this case is the 3M Headlight Restoration Kit. We're going to use this in the intended application method. That means we're going to use a drill and the included items. The items in this kit are a 3-inch foam-backed mandrel for the drill, 500 grit dry sandpaper, 800 grit wet or dry sandpaper, 3000 grit Trizact wet or dry sandpaper, I love this stuff, and 3M rubbing compound. We start off by masking off the headlight to ensure we don't accidentally sand or scrape the body of the car. Ideally would be to mask off a much larger area, as you'll see later on that we end up slinging stuff everywhere, but the kit doesn't come with anything extra, so we don't use it. Speaking of things that don't come extra in this kit, if you've seen my other headlight videos, which will be linked down below, you'll notice that there's nothing to protect the headlight when we're finished. There's no wax, no ceramic coating, no 2-component clear coat, nothing. This is a massive issue. What we're doing here today will only last a couple of months at best, and then these headlights will oxidize again. The reason for that is that we're not coating the headlights with anything to protect it from the UV damage that causes this oxidation in the first place. I want to make sure and make a note of this because I want to emphasize just how important this is for the continued protection of your headlights, and the downside of using only the stuff in these kits. After the headlight is masked off, we go ahead and clean the headlight. The instructions say to use soap and water, which is sufficient since we're sanding. I just prefer to use O&R, Optimum No Rinse, and a clay bar to remove surface level contaminants. Claying the surface just makes the sandpaper last a tiny bit longer before gumming it up. It's completely optional, and I probably shouldn't have done it in the video since I'm trying to go with only the items in the box, but I did it on autopilot and didn't even realize it. Once we have the headlight cleaned and wiped down, and we want it completely dry for this first step, because the sandpaper that we're using is a dry sandpaper only, we go ahead and put our sandpaper onto our drill. We start off with the 500 grit sandpaper and work it around the headlight. Since the drill is using a rotary motion, we have to be careful not to overheat the headlight. So we're not really applying much pressure here, just letting the drill do the work, and you can see at one point it tries to get away from me for just a brief second. We just work around the whole headlight, and once our sandpaper gums up on us, which you can see happen when it begins leaving deposits or marks on the headlight, we move on to a second piece of 500 grit. These kits give you 6 or 8 pieces of sandpaper, I'll admit I didn't count, and you can use half of them on the headlight and be perfectly fine. It just depends on how bad the headlight is for how much you'll need. In this case, I only had to use 2 to get a nice finish and be able to move on to our next step. After wiping the dust off of the headlight, we move on to our 800 grit. Fortunately for us, this is a wet or dry sandpaper, so we can get a bit of finer finish out of this by spraying the surface with soapy water, or in my case, O&R. Spray a couple of spritzes onto the surface and begin working it over the whole headlight. This will help keep the surface notably cooler and give us more working time out of our paper as well. Occasionally you'll want to wipe the slurry from the surface and spray a new amount of liquid onto the headlight. And if you're wondering what this white liquid is, it's actually the plastic that we're braiding off with the sandpaper. It can easily gum up our pads, so don't hesitate to spray down the headlight as often as you need to. I end up going through 2 pieces of 800 here, and probably honestly should have done a third. The more time we spend on the higher grit sandpapers, the better the finish in the end. Because we're jumping from 500 to 800 grit, it does take a little longer to get the prior sanding marks out, so just be patient and keep working it until you have a nice uniform surface, free of 500 grit scratches. On to our final grit, and honestly my favorite sandpaper. This is 3M's 3000 Grit Trizact sandpaper, which is just wonderful to work with. It is a wet or dry sandpaper, and it's also foam backed, which is always nice, but you always want to keep this stuff wet when you're using it. Go ahead and spray both the headlight and the sandpaper, and get to work with it. This step you can spend as much time as you need to on, as it is the final step here before we actually go on to polishing. You can see that the headlight actually begins to clear up on us as we work the 3000 grit, because it is slowly but steadily removing the 800 grit marks for us. Ideally, I would have preferred to go from the 800 to, say, a 1500 and then the 3000, but the kit doesn't come with that, so we just spend a bit more time on the 3000 before we move on to the last step. And now on to our final step, compounding and polishing. Take your 3M rubbing compound and spread it across the waffle pad. Make sure to get into all of the pores of the pad and don't leave any puddles of compound in the divots. Trust me on that one. This stuff is going to sling everywhere, so you're going to want to start off very slowly. Even going slow, I still made a mess with it. I don't think I've ever successfully used this kit without making a huge mess. Now, some of you may say, "Oh, Joe, just use less compound then." which is wonderful advice. However, we have to make sure our pad is primed properly, or else we run the risk of just transferring a ton of heat to the headlight without the compound to remove the scratches, which could lead to melting the headlight or just not actually accomplishing anything. We do have to be careful with this step to make sure the headlight stays cool, so occasionally check the temperature with your hand. If it gets too hot, just stop, give it a moment to cool down, or you can wipe off the compound, spray some water on it to cool it down quickly, dry it off, and get back to it. Alright, so that's it. Nice and simple process. But remember, if you're using only the kit and nothing extra, these headlights will fade again in only a few months. Watch my previous videos on headlight restoration to see how I actually apply a ceramic coating to the headlights afterward to keep them protected for several years to come. Stay tuned for my next headlight restoration video showing how much easier this can be using a dual action polisher by subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell so you're notified when that video comes out. As always, if you like my content, please share it with your friends as it helps a ton, and don't forget to like and comment as well. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.